Thank you everyone for being with us. And as we begin, please feel free to chime in the chat on Zoom and identify where you're tuning in from. It's great to see people joining from all over the world. So today's program is on anti-Semitism in the United Kingdom. I'm Ari Goldstein with the Office of the President at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. The issue of anti-Semitism lies at the foundation of the museum's work. When we remember the Holocaust and teach its lessons to future generations, we're talking about the very particular hatred of anti-Semitism, which has its own unique and tragic history. And we highlight that anti-Semitism found its zenith in the Holocaust, but began long before then and unfortunately continues today. The museum's educational work against anti-Semitism relies upon the generosity of people like you watching. So just a quick plug that if you enjoyed today's program, I encourage you to visit the museum's website and support our work if you can. Given this topic, it's a real pleasure to welcome Gideon Falter today to share his perspective on anti-Semitism in the UK, which is an increasingly worrying topic. Gideon is Chief Executive of the Campaign Against Antisemitism, which is a leading UK organization working to combat anti-Semitism and expose and counter it through education and through zero-tolerance enforcement of the law. Gideon will tell us more about his work, but he did join the campaign in summer 2014, around the time that fighting flared between Hamas and Israel and anti-Semitism was surging in Britain. Gideon was the principal organizer of a major rally outside the royal courts and was elected to lead Campaign Against Antisemitism that autumn. He's spoken at the House of Commons and has been publicly praised by Theresa May, and he also serves as a board member of the Jewish National Fund in the UK. So Gideon, welcome.
Thank you, Ari. Thank you for having me.
Before we get into the conversation today, I'm going to begin by playing a short clip about the Campaign Against Antisemitism's work, and it'll help contextualize the topic. So just a moment while I turn it on.
And every time, the anti-Semites must be arrested and prosecuted.
I met Gideon Falter of the Campaign Against Antisemitism.
The Equalities and Human Rights Commission, they announced they were taking the first step in a possible inquiry into anti-Semitism in the Labour Party.
We can talk now to Gideon Falter, who's from the Campaign Against Antisemitism, who registered a complaint with the Equalities and Human Rights Commission.
Every fake survivor's laughing, fake survivors' tongues are wagging, all its frauds are busy blagging.
The Crown Prosecution Service has been forced to look again at his decision not to prosecute a far-right activist, saying that England should be freed from Jewish control.
They are a terrorist group who believe in killing Jews.
In response to the work of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, Britain will be adopting a formal definition of anti-Semitism.
Thank you, Gideon. It's a great video, and I think a nice starting point for the conversation. So let's begin by addressing some of the statistics that were shown at the beginning of the video. 40% of Jews in Britain are considering leaving. Tell us a bit more about that. Why are Jews considering leaving the UK?
So this was a study that we did with King's College London, and what it revealed was that not just a large number of Jews are considering leaving, it also revealed the reasons behind that. And for a large number of the 40%, the main consideration was anti-Semitism in politics. And I think many of your viewers will know about Jeremy Corbyn and his ascent to the helm of the Labour Party. The Labour Party traditionally, I suppose, something like the Democratic Party in the United States, although to the left of it, I would say. It had been the pioneer of anti-racist legislation in the UK. And in fact, it created things like the Equality and Human Rights Commission, which we'll come on to later, which is now actually investigating the very party that created it. So for a lot of Jews looking at what's been going on in this country, the most concerning thing has been the rise of anti-Semitism in politics to the extent that it was actually able to take over a mainstream political party. Now, what's even more interesting to some extent is that when you go back, because we do these studies once a year, if you go back all of the way to our first study in 2015, you see that still then about a third of the UK Jewish community had been considering leaving, and they'd been considering leaving over anti-Semitic crime over particularly during the period of the Gaza war in 2014. So what we have is we have the Gaza war of 2014, which starts an absolutely huge outpouring of anti-Semitism in the UK, the worst ever on record at that time. And then we see it go from this worst ever moment during the Gaza war to Jeremy Corbyn taking over the Labour Party, anti-Semitism becoming normalised in our politics, until at the end of 2019, the end of last year, when that last survey was done, 40% of British Jews had considered leaving, and many of them were really actually looking into how they would go about doing that.
Thank you. When you say that anti-Semitism flared that summer and has been growing since then, I think it'd be helpful if you could give a few examples. What did it look like for Jews that summer?
You know, I back then was a Jew in the community who was not involved particularly in Jewish community life, in Jewish community organizations, I should say, sorry. I was very involved in Jewish community life. And I was observing really as somebody, you know, making my living and going about my life, I was observing a couple of incidents which really threw me and really made me question what was going on. One incident was that every year the UK has a Jewish film festival, and it had been using the same venue for 13 years. And the Jewish Film Festival was told that year by its venue, look, we know that you get a small grant, a small donation every year from the Israeli embassy in London. We want you to renounce Israel, give that money back, and you can still have your festival. And they said, well, hang on a minute, this is not some kind of political festival. This is just the Jewish Film Festival in London. Why are we being thrown out? Why are you demanding that we renounce Israel? Do you do that to any other community that holds film festivals at your venue? And this was a huge moment where the Jewish community felt truly rocked, because this was a liberal arts institution basically setting double standards, setting a new standard for Jews that nobody else was subject to. The other thing that really incensed me and made me feel that I, as an individual citizen, had something to do here, was when I saw this man. In fact, there's a picture of him in the video you just played. You'll have seen that man holding a sign above his head saying, "Save Gaza, Hitler, you were right." And I looked at that and I thought, this man just walked down Oxford Street. For those who know London, it's one of the major shopping streets in London, quite a smart street. And he has just walked down that street carrying that sign, and he felt no fear of any consequences of the law, of people remonstrating with him, of any kind of repercussions for what he was doing. And that to me said deterrence in this country is dead. Anti-Semitism has become a free hit. If you want to hate somebody, you know that you can hate the Jews and probably get away with it. And if you've got a situation like that, it's exceptionally dangerous, and Jews know that well from our history. And of course, you know, what you show at the museum is the most dire consequences of what can start there. So when you start seeing things start to unravel like that, I felt personally that I had a duty to do something about it. And it turned out so did many people in the Jewish community. And for example, with the tricycle, which threw out the venue that threw out the UK Jewish Film Festival, I went to one of the first demonstrations I've been to in my life outside the tricycle. British Jews generally do not demonstrate. We're quite well mannered and do not go on rallies, demonstrations, holding placards, shouting. And yet that's what we did outside the tricycle. It was organized by a group of people who didn't know each other, who found each other on Facebook, who later called ourselves Campaign Against Antisemitism. And what happened was that the tricycle had to do a U-turn. The venue had to do a U-turn. It apologized, invited the UK Jewish Film Festival back. Quite rightly, the UK Jewish Film Festival said they would never return. But that was a moment, in the context of all of this, where you start to think, what's going on here? Am I not a citizen like everybody else? We have laws in this country against racism. Why is it that they're being enforced for other types of hatred, not for anti-Semitism? If you're going to have a law, it's got to be a law for everybody. And similarly, why is nobody protesting against this? Why are non-Jewish people in our community happy largely to let this go by? Is it because they don't know it's happening? Is it because they don't understand the nuance of anti-Semitism? Is it because they agree with this? And so if you take the dinner party, the Shabbat dinner table conversation of 2014, which is about anti-Semitic crime, and then you go to 2015 and suddenly you've got Jeremy Corbyn in charge of the Labour Party, and then you go all of the way to 2019, we've just had, basically half a decade of an anti-Semite running the Labour Party in the UK. This is a huge amount of time with a vast amount of incidents, some of which we'll get a chance to talk about on this slot. And for most Jews, this was something that really shook their belief that they would grow up and live out their lives in Britain. So that's where we get to the 40% of people starting to consider whether they should leave.
Thank you. And you make me think of a major march that we had in New York City in January against anti-Semitism after a particularly horrible few weeks of violent incidents. And it was a powerful moment. And it also, I think, was mostly Jews attending. And I asked myself a version of that question. Are my non-Jewish community members not aware of what's happening? I really didn't know. We got a great question from Elizabeth Morales in the chat about recent events in Brooklyn. So it's, we'll focus on the UK, but I think there's a parallel conversation with some different nuances happening in New York and in the United States. So the summer of 2014 is an interesting start to your story because Israel figures in such a contentious and sometimes misunderstood way into conversations about anti-Semitism. I think that it highlights controversies over how we define anti-Semitism and what it looks like in practice. And I know that that is something you've worked on a lot, and you have a particular definition of anti-Semitism that you've advocated for. Can you bring us through that? What are the different working models of how to understand anti-Semitism, and why have you approached the definitional question in the way that you have?
So we started talking about definitions as soon as we set up in 2014, because it's very difficult to tackle something unless everyone agrees what it is that is the problem. And anti-Semitism, despite being the oldest hatred, is one of the least understood hatreds. Unlike most types of hatred, instead of trying to cast down the people that you're denigrating, that you're opposing, it kind of does both. It says Jews are dirty, vile, insidious, infectious, and dangerous to your society. But it also says Jews are so brilliantly cunning, so masterful, so intelligent, their schemes are so undetectable, that it kind of casts Jews upwards as well as downwards simultaneously. And on top of it, you then have this fairly well understood idea of Nazi era, Holocaust era anti-Semitism, racial anti-Semitism. You have a lesser understood, but also less prevalent religious anti-Semitism in some ways, except obviously it's very prevalent in Islamist circles. And then you've got the completely poorly understood sort of far left anti-Semitism. And that is the anti-Semitism that flourished during the Soviet era. The anti-Semitism of Zionism is racism. Jews are committing in Israel crimes akin to the crimes that were committed by the Nazis. And so you have all of this going on, and you don't really have any good way of defining it until what happened in 2005 was that the European Union needed to conduct a monitoring project, and the people who were being asked to do the monitoring project on anti-Semitism And they said, well, hang on a minute, how do you want us to define anti-Semitism? So they came up with a definition. And it turned out that it was a great definition. And as soon as we set up, we started using that definition. And the reason it's a great definition is because unlike most definitions that just say, anti-Semitism is X, Y, Z, it gives a list of examples of the types of thing that are anti-Semitism. So for example, drawing parallels between the actions of Nazi Germany and the actions of the modern state of Israel. That's not discourse about Israel. That's not something political. That's very clearly Jew hatred. And so what we've been able to do is take this definition and say to all these people who are either confused about what anti-Semitism is, or in many cases, people who are deliberately trying to blur the boundaries, and say, look, this is a definition which suits the modern day. It talks about the far right. It tells us about religious anti-Semitism, blood libels, etc. But it also talks about forms of anti-Semitism which seek to disguise themselves as just being criticism of Israel. And really, that was one of the hardest battles that we went into when we were talking about anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, was to convince people that what they were looking at, and make them understand what they were looking at, was not actually someone talking about Israel. They were talking about Jews. And there was a great example of that when Jeremy Corbyn, who we'll come on to, was addressing a crowd, and he said, there are Zionists who, despite having lived here their entire lives, don't understand English irony. And a Jew hearing a politician saying that says, hang on a minute, he doesn't mean Zionists who've lived here their entire lives. He's talking about Jews. But for a lot of non-Jews listening to that, or people who aren't familiar with anti-Semitism, they heard him saying that and they thought, maybe he's just talking about Zionists, maybe it's a political comment. So this definition really helps unpack that, and it's one of the most important tools that we have. And it's why we were very pleased that in 2016, we were able to ask, and Theresa May's government accepted, and Britain became the first country in the world to adopt the international definition of anti-Semitism, which was originally coined by the EU and was then later adopted now by the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance. So it's often known as the IRA definition after that alliance.
And since May's government adopted that definition, does it change? Is it legally enforceable? I mean, what does it mean that the government now recognizes anti-Semitism in the way that you do?
So what it means is it automatically levels the conversation that we have across a whole range of spheres. So we've had huge problems getting the authorities here to actually prosecute anti-Semitic crime. And when we have this definition, which basically lays the baseline for what anti-Semitism is, it's very helpful for sort of beginning those conversations. And we've now had even the judiciary in England and Wales has actually been sent elements of that definition, asked to have reference to it when, so it's not a law. It hasn't been debated in Parliament and enacted into a statute. But what we have got is a definition that is used in court cases. It is referred to, it's understood, it's used by regulators and sort of state and sort of enforcement bodies as a reference point. And so it's basically what we've been able to do is level the conversation and stop having this nonsense debate about what anti-Semitism is or is not, and talk instead about whether specific incidents and specific acts were anti-Semitic or not according to the definition.
I want to get in a minute more to this issue, but the Holocaust has come up a few times already, and it's always sort of in the back of our conversations as Jews about this. You mentioned it in terms of anti-Semites using the legacy of the Holocaust in their anti-Semitism today to talk about Israel in certain ways. They're willing to use it. To what extent are you willing to use it? I mean, do you feel when you're pointing out anti-Semitism in the UK today that it's appropriate to draw comparisons to what happened in Germany? Or do you find that that's too much of a lightning rod, or that you enable people to make equations rather than simply comparisons?
You know, it's a very interesting question, because obviously the UK in 2020 and at any point during my lifetime, thank God, has never been anything like Nazi Germany. So, you know, the idea that there is a direct comparison, I think, would really it would really startle a lot of people to even hear that. And there isn't a direct comparison. You know, we're fortunate to live in a country where the government is understands what anti-Semitism is. It wants to act against anti-Semitism. Maybe it doesn't do so as forcefully or as well as we would like it to. But, you know, the idea of sort of state-sanctioned anti-Semites coming and rounding up Jews to kill them is, thank God, a very remote possibility. Is a very, very, very remote idea, and not going to happen in this country. But the thing is, you don't really need it to get that bad. And one of the things that I find when talking to Holocaust survivors is, particularly over the last few years, prior to Jeremy Corbyn's removal from office, one of the things that the Holocaust survivors have said is that they felt that there were echoes of what they experienced. And they didn't mean that this was a parallel situation. They simply meant that there were certain things that were happening, certain types of normalization of anti-Semitism, which made them feel very uncomfortable. And it would be very irresponsible to say that there is a direct comparison between what happened then and what's happening now. But for certain, there was an instinct, if you like, that Holocaust survivors had that was triggered by what happened in the last few years.
And survivors are our collective conscience in so many communities. I see that we have some attendees raising their hands in Zoom. If you have questions, we would very much welcome them. Just please submit them in writing in the chat or in the Q&A feature in Zoom, and we'll take them that way. So Gideon, we were talking a moment ago about prosecutions and that zero-based enforcement, zero tolerance enforcement of the law is a core feature of your work. Can you talk to us more about that and what type of prosecutions are plausible within the UK's legal system?
So within the UK, as in much of the world, obviously the United States is a very different, has a very different legislative framework. In the UK, most forms of anti-Semitism, if you express them, will cross over into criminality. But that doesn't translate into an awful lot of prosecutions. And one of the things that motivated me in 2014 was to see that there were a vast number of anti-Semitic crimes occurring, very few prosecutions happening. And so what we set out to do was to try to ensure that the law was enforced. And whether or not you agree with the UK's laws on anti-Semitism, I think everyone can agree that if they exist and they're enforced for some groups, they should be enforced for all groups. And as Jews, we felt that we were being ignored and that the UK was failing to take action. So to give you a couple of examples of the sorts of things that we were seeing, one of the first cases that we took on was the singer who you saw in the clip at the beginning of the video, the one who was talking about, you know, fake survivors, tongues are wagging. And she is really somebody who nobody knows or ought to know particularly, a cruise ship singer who turned her, unfortunately rather lacking musical talents, to making songs mocking Holocaust survivors, mocking Jews, alleging that there was a Jewish conspiracy. And she started to get a following on social media. And obviously we live in a world now where once upon a time, these people were treated as lunatics who would speak to other lunatics in small rooms somewhere, you know, to crowds of 10 or 20 people. But on social media, they suddenly get a big audience. And we spoke to the police about this, and the police said, well, we're not convinced that she's committing any crime. And there was a law on the statute book, which actually dates back a long way. It dates back to the days when, you know, if you wanted to call someone on the telephone, there was no keypad, there was no rotary dial even. You would just pick up the telephone, you would ask, there would be somebody there, and in those days, the operators were all female. And you would ask the operator, please, can you connect me to Westminster 328? And she would take the plug and plug it into the other plug, and you would get connected to Westminster 328. And the members of parliament of the day, who were all men, were very concerned that these female telephone operators would hear rude words, and such was the sort of patriarchal approach of the time that they decided to enact a law which ended up staying on the statute books and kind of became Britain's law on electronic communications, threats and crime, etc. And what this law now says is that if you send a grossly offensive communication down a public communications network, then you commit a crime. And we looked at this and we said, well, we find Holocaust denial grossly offensive, and we say that YouTube and Twitter are public communications networks, and we believe that a crime has been committed. And the state said, well, we're not so sure. And so what we did is we used a right in the UK of private prosecution. And really it's a check on the power of the state, because the state has an immense power to prosecute. But if you think about it, the power to not prosecute is also very strong power. And as a balance on that, in the UK, you can privately prosecute somebody for a crime if the state refuses to do so. And so the state had refused to prosecute, so we decided to prosecute. And we ended up, the state ended up taking over the prosecution when they saw that it was succeeding. We ended up with the first ever conviction that I know of over Holocaust denial in the UK on social media. And so the UK, a country which doesn't actually have a statute on Holocaust denial, and even though back when we were members of the European Union, we signed up to a framework saying that we would enact laws against Holocaust denial, we never did it. We didn't have a statute against Holocaust denial, and despite that, because of our private prosecution, somebody was convicted. And this somebody, this Alison Chablos, actually appealed. I believe she tried to appeal twice. The second time she was thrown out of court. The first time the appeal was upheld. So we have established a precedent in British law which is binding on lower courts. But we didn't just want to be taking action against anti-Semites ourselves. We also felt, if this is the job of the state, then the state needs to take action. And so what we did was we used a process called judicial review. And judicial review is another check on the power of the state in the UK, which says if the government or a state body does something, then their decision can be subjected to the review of a judge to see whether or not it was lawful. And there are various grounds for judicial review. It's very difficult to do. And if you want to review a decision not to prosecute somebody, you essentially have to prove not just that the prosecutor was wrong not to prosecute, but they were so wrong that no reasonable prosecutor would have acted in that way. And so what we ended up with was the case of a man called Jeremy Bedford Turner. Jeremy Bedford Turner was a far-right leader who was one of the principal organizers of a march through Golders Green in London against the, quote, Jewification of the area. And if any of your viewers know Golders Green, they will know that he's a little bit late to the party. It's one of the biggest Jewish populations in London and in the UK. But he decided that he was going to organize this demonstration. We were successful in getting the demonstration stopped from going ahead in Golders Green, but it did go ahead. You don't have in the UK a power to stop a demonstration, so all we could do is move it. The demonstration went ahead, and this man made a speech calling on the far-right people, many of them thugs, who were assembled around him, calling on them to, quote, free England from Jewish control, and blaming every single possible Jewish conspiracy he could, and almost running through them like he was checking off a list. And we took this to the police, and they took it to the Crown, and the Crown is the body it's the Crown that prosecutes crime in the UK on behalf of the Queen. And we said, you need to prosecute this man. And they said no. And we said, fine, we want the independent review of this case to be undertaken, which is our right. And they said, no, it's not your right, it's the right of victims. And victims, in this case, where it's a speech against Jews, victims would be all Jews, and you are not all Jews, you are just some Jews, so we're not going to give you the right. And they played around with us. And we said to them, look, we're going to sue you. And there was this sort of disbelief from the people that we knew in the Crown Prosecution Service who really didn't believe that we were actually going to sue the Crown. If you think about it, it's quite a big thing. It's quite a big undertaking to take on, especially when you bear in mind that in order to win, we'd have to show not just that the Crown was wrong, but they made a decision that no reasonable prosecutor would have made. And at the end of this very long process, we went to court and their Queen's Counsel called our Queen's Counsel. And they said, well, look, let's settle this case. And we said, no, we don't want to settle the case unless you agree to prosecute this man. And they said, well, that's not what's going to happen. And in the end, they agreed to review the decision. They did prosecute him, and he was convicted unanimously by a jury of incitement to racial hatred. And despite having no prior offenses, he was sent to jail for a year. And the purpose of the kinds of action that we're taking is really deterrence. If you look at what happened in the wake of the Shoah, you have survivors who wanted to ensure that what happened to them could never happen again to a future generation of Jews. And they put in place mechanisms to try to ensure that. They put in place physical guarding at Jewish institutions, at synagogues, community centers. They put in place education programs to try to inoculate future generations against hatred. They put in place research to try to make sure that if people started to, if anti-Semitism started to raise its head again, then they would be able to track it and to know about it long in advance. And the last leg of what they did was to actually try to ensure that there was deterrence. They sought out the Nazis who had escaped, and they tried to bring them to justice. And it wasn't a mission of vengeance. It was a mission to ensure that future generations would know, if you commit atrocities like this, you will not live another day in your life without looking over your shoulder, wondering when you're going to be brought to justice. And with cases that we have brought, what we have successfully done is sent shockwaves through anti-Semitic communities who see some of their leaders and also some of their less important people being plucked out and taken down for what they're doing. And it's also sent a shockwave through the authorities, which was used to dealing with a very compliant Jewish community, which didn't demonstrate, which didn't sue anybody, which never banged its fists on the table and said, when are you going to do your job and protect me? And suddenly we were banging our fists on the table and saying, when are you going to do your job and protect us? And it's very important, I feel, particularly in the context of what's going on in the United States, and I guess we'll come to that as well. It's very important to ensure that anti-Semites fear the consequences of their actions, know that there is a real deterrent that the Jewish community is able to wield against them. And it's equally important that the authorities know that if they do not fulfill their duty to look after the Jewish community and protect their Jewish community, that they will be held to account.
It's an amazing story. Let me mention something about speech law in the United States, because it's an important contrast. So in the US, speech, as you know, in the public sphere is basically fully allowed unless it falls into a few specific categories: obscenity, fraud, child pornography, speech that is integral to doing illegal conduct, or, and the key part for anti-Semitism is speech that incites violence. But that's a pretty rigorous standard. You mentioned that part of the prosecution of the man you went after with the Crown was incitement to hatred, which is a lower bar than incitement to violence. And then with the operator on the telephone anecdote, the standard there was just that the speech was offensive. So what is the actual legal standard that you can use to go after anti-Semitism, and how does it differ from what we have here?
One of the misleading things about legal terms in the UK is that they often sound very different to how they actually are. So in order to prove something is grossly offensive in the UK, it's not just that it's offended you very badly. It tends to be that there is some element of threat or fear or something like that which is included in it. Incitement, sorry?
A threat of violence.
Potentially not violence. Potentially it might be something non-violent. But generally speaking, there has to be that sense of causing fear. In the case of incitement to racial hatred, it's not just that you have to prove that somebody was inciting other people to hatred. you also have to show that there was an actual, if you like to simplify it, a call to action of some kind, where they were actually calling, not just their incitement was not just to hate, but actually to act on that hatred. And in order to actually prosecute a case of incitement to racial hatred, you actually have to get the Attorney General's consent, which in the UK, it's not a state Attorney General. We don't really have states as you do there. It's the Attorney General is a member of the National Cabinet, and it's a very, very senior position, and it's a very big responsibility. So for the Attorney General of the United Kingdom to sign off on a prosecution, you've got to really have your ducks in a row, as we say. So it's not just that you can go after people for inciting hatred. There's generally got to be a really sinister element to it. And I think also it's important not to go after borderline cases, but to come back to this sort of debate between absolute freedom of expression and the ability to prosecute hate crimes. I think by and large, Britain has got it right, because if you look at what happened, and again, I'm sorry to come back to the Shoah, but if you look at what happened, say, in Nazi Germany, it is not always the case that counter speech can triumph over hatred. And if you look at what is said about Jews today, they are still in large part relying on adapted versions of conspiracy theories which were coined or popularized by the Nazis. And this very sort of insidious, seditious form of conspiracy theory, which is becoming more and more popular nowadays, it has the ability to become viral, to be spread to large numbers of people, and really subvert society. And I, as a Jew in Britain, have been looking at Jews across the rest of Europe. And I've been looking at, for example, what's happened in France, what's happened in Belgium, what's happened in various other countries, where Jews are being shot dead for being Jews in terrorist attacks, where many Jews are quite fearful about openly expressing their Judaism. And you look at that and you think, how did we get here? And you realize that a large part of it was failure to act against the incitement. So there's a debate to be had about where the line should be drawn, but I feel that the United States, in many ways, it has a very permissive view towards freedom of speech. And I think it's quite dangerous in some ways, because if you look, for example, at what happened in that awful terrorist attack in Pittsburgh, the shooter was very obviously intent on killing Jews. He'd said so on social media many times. And yet the first time that he would really have been arrestable under laws in the United States was when he submitted his last social media post saying, "I'm going in." That would have been the moment at which police or law enforcement could swoop on him. But until then, he'd basically been behaving in a lawful way. And I think it's very dangerous if you set the protective limit of the law so close to somebody being able to commit an act of mass murder.
I'm sure many of our viewers will remember personally that, although I don't, but the incident in Skokie, Illinois in 1977 with the American Nazi Party wanting to march, or a more recent echo in Charlottesville in 2017. And just a quick plug, on May 19th, we're hosting a program with Amy Spitalnik and Michael Block from Integrity First for America, who are somewhat mirroring Gideon's work in the United States. They're suing the perpetrators of the Unite the Right rally in Charlottesville and the people who killed Heather Heyer, but they don't have as permissive they have more of a permissive legal framework. So there's an interesting statute from 1871 they've pulled out of the closet and are trying to mobilize. Gideon, there's a lot of great questions coming in. There's a few here about sort of anti-Semitism in the public sphere and in politics. We have a question from David Hirsch about the environment on university campuses for Jewish students. We have a question from Joe Aids about how you educate against anti-Semitism in the public sphere and in schools. So let's transition the conversation a little bit to that arena. how would you define the political conversation in the UK around anti-Semitism? What's going on the left and on the right? And then let's get to universities.
So it's been a journey, because if you'd asked me that question in 2014, I would have told you that probably most people in Britain didn't really know the word anti-Semitism. They hadn't met or really thought about Jews particularly. And this is, completely understandable. We've got a very small Jewish community in the UK. We're only 250,000 Jews in this country, in a population of 66 odd million. So for most people, they didn't really know about anti-Semitism, and those that did know about anti-Semitism, Holocaust education is mandatory in this country in all schools. So everybody knew about the Holocaust, but even then, you had a lot of people not really realizing it was about Jews, or not really realizing the mechanics of the Holocaust, the details of the Holocaust, what actually was done. They knew about it as a historical event in a sort of superficial level of detail in many cases. So in 2014, we had a national situation where the far right was attempting to regain its foothold. You had Islamist organizations which had been trying to radicalize elements of the Muslim community in the UK and trying to spread an anti-Semitic sort of perversion of Islam. And you then had people on the far left who had long been getting away with really quite blatant anti-Semitism, but disguising it in the language of anti-Zionism, anti-Israel, and all of this sort of thing, when actually it was nothing to do with Israel at all. It was really just about a way of bashing Jews. So in 2014, people didn't really know what was going on. What's happened with the ascent of Jeremy Corbyn is that the Labour Party essentially stopped taking serious action against anti-Semites within the party. So people in the far left started to get a free ride within the Labour Party. And what we also saw was that not just that they didn't take action against anti-Semites, but sometimes they would defend them. So we have examples, for example, of senior officials in the Labour Party, some of the most senior officials in the Labour Party, really defending people who were into Holocaust denial. And what we've done as a campaigning organization is we faced a huge challenge, because first of all, we had to convince the media that when we spoke to them about anti-Semitism on the far left, it was an actual thing. It wasn't just us trying to talk about Israel. It was nothing to do with Israel. It was actual Jew hatred. So that was the first challenge, was convincing journalists that what they were looking at was Jew hatred and something they should do about. The second thing was doing that in a way that the public actually engaged with, so that when people who were not particularly engaged with anti-Semitism, didn't know any Jews in their life, and weren't really thinking about this in that, this was not something they sat and worried about at work or in the evenings, we had to convince the public that they should care about anti-Semitism, that it was a problem that if left untreated, what starts with the Jews never ends with the Jews. And lastly, what we had to do is we had to figure out how to actually make all of this stick, because it's not good enough to just say, okay, there's a problem with anti-Semitism in the Labour Party. Everybody is concerned about it, including people outside the Jewish community. There's a lot of noise around it. It's not good enough to just do that. And we were at the forefront of the media campaign to do that, to expose it. But what you also have to do is you have to figure out a way of actually making it stick. And what one would normally hope to do is use the institutions and mechanisms within the Labour Party to bring disciplinary charges against people, activists, members of parliament, peers, lords, etc. What you would hope to do is use the mechanisms of the Labour Party to act against them. Mm-hmm. But that wasn't available to us, because Jeremy Corbyn had installed people within the party who were failing to take any action against anti-Semitism, were actually perverting the institutions that were supposed to deal with things like anti-Semitism. So in the end, we ended up making a referral and legal representations to this body called the Equality and Human Rights Commission. And the Equality and Human Rights Commission is an organization which was created by the Labour Party back in 2006, when the Labour Party was really an organisation at the forefront of fighting racism and very much an ally of Jews. And it created this organisation that could really go to any other organisation and say, look, you are discriminating against a group, we're going to investigate you. At the end of our investigation, we will issue an action plan and you must comply with the action plan. And it was never really considered, I don't think, that the Equality and Human Rights Commission would end up taking action against political parties. But by the point that we made the referral to the Commission in 2018, things had got so bad within the Labour Party that they actually ended up opening a full statutory investigation into the Labour Party at our behest. And we've worked a lot with the Commission since then and made a lot of legal submissions to them. The vast majority of our lawyers act pro bono. Sometimes we have to pay for advice, so we've had a mix of paid and pro bono lawyers doing a vast amount of work, not just on this, but also on the criminal cases we've taken on. And at the end of all of this, what we have got is the British public becoming aware of anti-Semitism in the Labour Party, feeling that it was something that they personally needed to worry about as a matter of decency and a matter of caring about the direction their country was going in. We've had a huge amount of media pressure on the Labour Party to actually act on this, and as the Labour Party failed to act, we're now actually able to ensure that there is some kind of legal pressure brought to bear on the Labour Party. And it's not just the Equality and Human Rights Commission. We've actually ended up, and as I mentioned, crimes like incitement to racial hatred are very severe crimes in the UK. We've actually had Labour activists who have been arrested and charged with incitement to racial hatred during this period. So how do British people see anti-Semitism? Now, I think that most British people really understand what anti-Semitism is. They really care about it. One of the things that we saw in some polling that was released last year was how many British people really care about anti-Semitism. And we've also seen somebody who was really revered and who many people thought of as an anti-racist, really being disgraced through his own actions. And Jeremy Corbyn now, I think, is widely understood to be an anti-Semite. And in fact, in some polling that I saw, I think only 18% of British voters believed Jeremy Corbyn when he said that neither he nor the Labour Party were anti-Semitic.
So in the United States, President Trump has spoken, maybe with an inartful turn of phrase, a few times about what he calls the Jexit. He says there's an anti-Semitism on the left here, Jews should stop voting with Democrats and start voting with Republicans. Without commenting on the validity of that claim, it's been curious to me that conservatives in Britain have not perhaps made as public of an effort to bring Jews over as voters. What's going on there? And now that Corbyn is no longer the head of the Labour Party, will the situation change?
I think there's a recognition, and I think it's really important, that anti-Semitism should never really be a political issue. In times gone by, in 2014, when we looked at anti-Semitism, all political parties essentially had the same stance on it. If you're anti-Semitic, you're out. Mm-hmm. And there were exceptions to that. There were some parties which were worse at it than others. But generally speaking, that was at least their declared position. And when anti-Semitism becomes a party political matter, it's an extremely dangerous thing. If you look at 2019, and we were hearing a lot of British Jews, and we're an apolitical organisation. We have no political affiliation whatsoever. We would never advocate for one political party over another. But we were hearing from a lot of people in the Jewish community saying, I don't feel like I can vote for this, for the Labour Party because it's institutionally anti-Semitic. And when you hear that, it's not an opportunity for the other political parties to sort of bring Jews in. It's really a very, very dire warning about the state of politics in the country. If there's a party that one minority cannot vote for because of its racism, then it means that, and if that is a mainstream political party, then in order for it to still be a mainstream political party, it either means that it's been overrun, which the Labour Party was in the UK. It was overrun by people who did not care about anti-Semitism at the time. Those were the people in charge. Or it means that a lot of people don't care about anti-Semitism. And both of those two things are very, very dangerous. Thankfully, in the UK, a huge number of people do care about anti-Semitism. And it turned out that one of the things that was most damaging for the Labour Party in the last election, and again, we're not a political organisation, but one of the things that was most damaging for them was the fact that people looked at them and thought, why are you not taking action against anti-Semitism? Why have we had years of these disgusting cases coming out? And why is it still going on? And why are people not being punished? And what is wrong with you that is this case in your party? So it's more an alarm bell that should ring. And I think it's always very dangerous if anti-Semitism becomes political.
Outside of your immediate work, who are the upstanders in the UK on this topic? Are there public figures, celebrities, or political leaders who have been real allies?
You know, there are a few people who have really stood tall on this. And in fact, a lot of them turn out to be women as well. So we've had people like Tracy Ann Oberman, Rachel Riley, Maureen Lipman, various celebrities in the UK, mostly Jewish, but some not, who have said, enough. I know that it's not good for my career, but I'm going to stand up to this. And we've also had incredible people within the Labour Party. And I'll give you a few examples of that. I think it was 2017, during the Labour Party conference, it was held in Brighton, and the leader of Brighton, the local authority in Brighton, was actually from the Labour Party, and it was a Labour-controlled municipality, I believe. And he said, my own party's political conference, annual conference, has become so riven with anti-Semitism that I'm going to ban my own party from holding its own conference in my my municipality in future years, unless it deals with this. And you have people like Ian Austin, who is a member of, or was a member of Parliament in Dudley, a part of the UK which probably doesn't have very many Jews at all. They probably count them on both hands. And Ian Austin said, look, I'm not Jewish, but I joined the Labour Party because I detest racism. And even though it will be politically ruinous for me to do so, I am going to quit the Labour Party. I'm going to vocally expose and oppose the anti-Semitism within it. And so you have real heroes like that who have come from the world of media or who have come from the world of politics and have really stood tall and have said, look, this is not about my career. This is not about getting points with one group or another. This is just about human decency. And I think that most countries and most places have these people in abundance, and it's about having the faith that those people will stand up and do the right thing when it comes to it. And one of the things that has given me the most satisfaction in this work is meeting people, including many of our volunteers. You know, we've got 1,300 people signed up to volunteer with us. And many of the people who are most active within our organization, within our work, are people who are not Jewish, who are very senior professionals in some cases, top academics, top lawyers, top media professionals, or who are people who are retired and just decide basically to come back to the battle lines from a position of great comfort and decide to fight this. And it's a very heartening thing to see the goodness in the country when an issue like this rears its head.
Absolutely, and it's incumbent upon us to thank people who do step up, I think, to encourage it. We have just like 5 more minutes, so let me give you 2 questions for our closing moments. First, the universities. I want to address it because it came up in a few questions that people submitted. What is the status of anti-Semitism on British campuses in your perspective, and how has your work touched that?
Very briefly, the situation in UK universities, I hold largely responsible for the possibility of somebody like Jeremy Corbyn actually rising in British politics. And also a lot of the crime that is happening, particularly online, we're seeing a lot of it coming from quite young people who have been radicalized on university campuses. The problem there is deep-seated. It goes even deeper than anti-Semitism in political parties and even deeper than anti-Semitism online. a problem where the institution of universities have allowed anti-Semitism sometimes to flourish against faculty. It has really taken root amongst certain student organizations. And one of the things that we do is we hold universities to account. And in fact, this is an area where there is more possibility of action in the United States, because the laws in the United States are more useful in this respect when there's a publicly funded institution involved. And we're able to hold universities to account legally for protecting their Jewish students. And it's vitally important that we do so, because the universities are really the incubator where the anti-Semitism online and in political parties starts to flow from.
Right. So lastly, at the very beginning, we showed that 40% figure of Jews who are considering leaving the UK, but you've done a lot of work. As you said, a lot more average British people are familiar with Jews and with anti-Semitism. Corbyn is now gone as the head of the Labour Party. Is that 40% number going to grow or shrink? What do the next few years look like?
What my hope is, obviously coronavirus throws a spanner in everybody's plans, but what my hope is that we will see a diminishing of this figure. We will see Jewish people in the UK becoming increasingly confident about their future in the country. It depends to a large degree on the success of our future work. We have to keep driving the point home with political parties, on campuses, online, in the criminal justice system. And if we succeed in those areas, then I think that we will see the Jewish community becoming much more confident. One of the things that I've been very interested to see is that we've had a lot of people start to approach us from the United States, from other countries as well, saying, you know, essentially what you do is you change the way the media looks at anti-Semitism, you litigate in very innovative ways, you change the way that the government creates policy on anti-Semitism. Could you come and do that in our country too? And so we're having some very interesting discussions with people from all sorts of different countries about how we can help. And so what my hope is not just that this much more muscular, if you like, approach to defending against anti-Semitism. We're hoping that this approach will not just succeed in Britain, but it will also succeed in other countries, and we'll start to see that 40% shrink, not just in Britain, but in other countries too. And I would encourage, I know that we haven't had probably the opportunity to go through a lot of the questions that have come through, but if people are interested in talking about our work, they can contact us through info@antisemitism.uk. And if you mention that it was from this talk, I will make a particular effort to try to respond myself. Or just check out our website at antisemitism.uk or antisemitism.org. And there's plenty of information there about what we're doing, how the approach works. And if you think it could work in your country too, in the United States or anywhere else, be in touch.
Thank you, Gideon. That's a good note to end on. And I'm impressed you got the URL, antisemitism.uk.
It turns out it wasn't a very popular website. Who knew?
Well, maybe it shouldn't, and hopefully someday it won't be popular again because it won't need to be.
Indeed.
Gideon, we're grateful for your time and your insight today and for sharing with us a little bit of your work and the situation on the ground in the UK.
Ari, I'm so happy that we got to do this. Thank you very much for having me.
And to everyone who tuned in, thank you for being here and for being so engaged with questions. I'm glad we got to get to a few of them. If you enjoyed watching today's conversation, please check out the Museum of Jewish Heritage and the Campaign Against Antisemitism on social media. And of course, we would always appreciate donations to support this work and help it continue. On behalf of the museum, thank you all again. Gideon, have a good evening, and everyone in the United States, have a good afternoon. Take care.
Thank you.